All right, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you're doing well. We are live here at MythVision Podcast. We're going to talk about 30 arguments against the existence of God, heaven, hell, Satan, and divine design. Continuing where we left off before, let's get the party started. With the right intro, actually. Let's get the party started. We are MythVision. Ladies and gentlemen, will you take the time to go get a copy of 30 Arguments Against the Existence of God, Heaven, Hell, Satan, and Divine Design by ours, or yours truly, author Jonathan MS Pearce. How are you doing, my friend?
I am doing particularly well. It's a beautiful afternoon. The Queen has been reigning for 70 years, although we gave up one of our main colonies because you guys weren't worth it. And I'm as you might guess, I'm a super uber monarchist. So we've got 4 days off, and brilliant. Let's have an intellectual party.
I think so. I definitely look forward to hearing what you have to say continuing on in the series. If anybody will, go find this little YouTube. Actually, I put the wrong link in the chat. I'm putting that right now. Go subscribe to A Tippling Philosopher. He has a YouTube channel, and so you can go support your favorite author over here and listen to what he has to say. There's a lot of material he's been putting out, so you can go over there and hang out with him, harass him, argue against him, tell him how wrong he is or how right he is. Either way. Point is, go support him. Check him out there. He is also on onlysky.media. And that link is, I believe I put it in the description. It better be in the description. If not, brownie points are lost for me. And then also help consider joining MythVision's Patreon. Every month, I don't know what it is, and I have to make this point, 40, 50 people drop from the Patreon every month. And it's like they drop, and then the next month I'll gain back up. And then it puts me in a very tough spot because what I'm doing is full time, and then I'm losing. This month I lost about 55 to 60, and it's always at the turn of the first when payments go through that people ended up jumping. So I could use people who are interested in actually supporting and sticking around if you're able. Any help is any help, but it kind of gets me on the edge of my seat because this is how I make sure I can do this full time for my family, my 3 kids. I'm moving soon. That's another thing. I'm moving to Washington State. So please consider, I'm working my butt off to try and get you more content. I'm currently editing 3 or 4 more videos. I've got lives coming up with Francesca Stavrakopoulos, Candida Moss on the myth of persecution. I've got a guy named, I'm probably butchering his name. It's Zema, or it's a Tzemah, Yore. And he wrote a book called Why Abraham Murdered Isaac. I'm having him on next Wednesday. He has 2 PhDs. This guy is a supplementary hypothesis, and like this, I'm working extra hard. So if you like believe in what we're doing at MythVision, I really can use like diehard fan help type stuff that's consistent, and it doesn't cost a lot. It's really simple. You can join for $3 a month. You'll access all the videos. If you want to buy the whole year up front, you can do that as well. But this is what I do, so I have to be a shameless plug in order for this thing to stay alive and to keep doing what I'm doing. That's my plug there. Jonathan, where did we leave off last time on 30 arguments, my friend?
Well, I think we got to the end of part 3, which ended with what the holy books forgot to say, which is chapter 16, argument 16, and talked about how the Bible says some horrible things, but it also doesn't say an awful lot of stuff which it really should say if it's going to be a moral revelation for humanity. And what's worth starting off, as ever, by saying is that the God we are talking about is OmniGod, right? So there are many gods as there are believers. And so whenever we have discussions like this, people go, well, yeah, that's not the sort of God I believe in, or that's not my God, or what if God's like this? We can't attack every version of God, because like a pea in a shell game, the believer can just move the pea around and go, oh, you've attacked this cup. Well, actually, God's under this cup. And so what we have to do is take the greatest commonalities, which are, I would argue, omniscience, so full knowledge, including full divine foreknowledge. So, all knowing, omnipotence, all powerful, omnibenevolence, all loving. And once we take those ideas, I think we're covering a lot of ground, and there are a lot of believers that will adhere to those notions of God. And what this book looks to do is say, well, either that God doesn't exist, or God does exist but doesn't have those properties. Is that fair enough to start with?
I think so. I mean, and your book is dealing with the OmniGod. So you can come up with conceptions. Of course, this is what some people do when they watch the show. They don't like the fact that you're saying these things about God. It's like, it's weird to me because there's this baggage about this term we use for God. And it's like when you use God, well, that's not the God I'm talking about. And they get really triggered or something. And it's like, I mean, God is like this rubber band. You can make it whatever you want to make it at this point. You've got people from open theist within the Christian bubble, for example, open theist to hard determinist.
Yeah.
Like where God doesn't have even a personality, so to speak. God is what God is, and it is, you know what I mean?
And we talked about that. So I'd argue, and one of the arguments, or several of the arguments we talked about, concern the idea that God is an automaton. So there is no way around. If God has full divine foreknowledge, God knows every future event of what he creates, his contingent creations, but also of himself. And therefore, if he knows his own future actions, he can only do what his knowledge dictates and his nature dictates. In other words, he is just a kind of robot himself, and which is an interesting argument. But anyway, we've done that one. What we're going to move on to today is to start with in part 4 of the book is the problem of evil arguments, right? So a really kind of popular set of arguments that you often see critiquing this idea of God, because they are very emotive arguments, the problem of evil. So the problem of evil is broadly that if God has all those qualities, and there is, at least some suffering, I would say a great amount of suffering, what explains the fact that this suffering exists? If God knew enough to know what to do about it, was powerful enough to be able to do something about it, and was loving enough to care enough to want to do something about it. So given those properties, why is there so much suffering in the world? And what Christians do, or theists do, I say Christians, but for these arguments, these are generally theistic arguments or criticisms against general theism, classical theism. What the theist will do, what the Christian will do is say, well, hang on, I can defend God against these criticisms of why there is so much suffering or evil. And these are generally called theodicies. And theodicies are arguments that look to get God off the hook, to show that, do you know what? Suffering isn't incompatible with an all-loving, an omni-God. And so that's the kind of landscape of what we're going to be dealing with today. However, I will say this. It's interesting presenting theodicies. There is some philosophers will say that even trying to dream up a theodicy is itself kind of evil, right? So it's, in other words, imagine, let's go to the big one that everyone knows, Godwin's law. Let's talk about the Holocaust, right? Imagine sitting down and going, right, the Holocaust happened, 6 million Jews died. They were actually God's chosen ones. So, bonus there. A bonus in terms of like, that's weird. Let's sit down and be like this super PR agent. And our sole intention, being a believer, is to get God off the hook. So I'm going to sit down and go, and this is like the PR job of all PR jobs. It's like the Holocaust. How do we make this look good? Now, imagine sitting down and doing that in general. Imagine being like someone that's trying to show that the Holocaust is a really good thing. You'd be like, that's morally really reprehensible. And yet, actually, that is what the theist has to do with every single bit of suffering. So there are some people that say even dreaming up theodicies is itself morally problematic.
I would love to like throw out something that I would imagine saying as a theist 10, 12 years ago. And maybe you just tackle this little idea of mine. And it is, and I can imagine saying something against it. So I'm just going to give you the idea, right? They'll say something like, listen, who do you think you are, right? First of all, sit down, mister. I'm going to challenge and critique my God. My God knows all things, and he knows the right thing to do. And all of this suffering, including this Holocaust, is part of the plan, because this life is this, right? So they're starting with this already presuppositional approach of saying like, life is this little thing, and it's really kind of like whatever, because there's this eternity, right? They talk about this eternity. They want to try and act like this temporal suffering is nothing, and it's okay that God can do that because he has this reward for them. But even if you were to say that, all right, are we saying all the Jews who didn't accept Christ that were killed in the Holocaust, they are in heaven now, or are they not in heaven now, right? So for Christianity, this can be a problem. I'll out the gate, unless they think Jews go to heaven, because there are certain versions of Christianity that say, well, the Jews have a different covenant with God, and they didn't really have to have Jesus. And then, but like this whole idea that suffering here is nothing, it's just this little inkling and get over it, is, to me, it's just kind of an excuse to create this idea like, well, it's all planned in the future. We're going to have in heaven, we're going to have bliss and no pain, no more tears, no more suffering, anything like that.
I'm going to return to that idea of like using heaven to justify morally bad things, because in fact, let's get that out of the way now, right? Sure. Christians do that. Oh, in fact, before I start, there's a guy, or I presume a guy, considering Phlebas at the side in the live chat. Now, interesting reference there to Ian Banks, the sci-fi author. But anyway, I love it when atheists pretend theists are the ones with the problem of morality. Now, this is really important, because actually I want to get this out of the way as well, which is to say that, do you know what? Forget about atheists and their morality, because I am arguing as if I was a Christian, as in these arguments are from a Christian's point of view. In other words, you have to answer these. Like, there's no good. This is called the tu quoque fallacy, which is the U2 fallacy. It's like to say, I'm saying, hang on, you've murdered someone, Derek, right? That's morally bad. You can't say, yeah, I've murdered someone, but you've murdered someone. Yeah, I may have murdered someone. I may have murdered someone, but it doesn't make the fact that you murder someone morally, it doesn't explain that or justify it. Mm-hmm. So it's irrelevant what atheists believe in terms of morality. In fact, we all generally believe very different things in terms of morality. I'm a moral skeptic, for example, ontologically speaking, but that's irrelevant. We are arguing about theism from a theistic viewpoint here. So therefore, that's irrelevant. That is the tu quoque fallacy. So anyway, we're getting onto heaven justifying morally bad actions. Now, this is really common, and you hear this. So, say a baby dies of cancer at the age of 6 months, and you hear the Christian come along and say, "Okay, that sounds horrible, but actually, the baby lives in heaven for eternity, so it's all fine." Really common tactic. It's not good enough. So what that is compensation, and it's not moral justification. So for example, Derek, and I've said this in plenty of my videos, if I walked up to you, Derek, and punched you full in the face and broke your jaw, right? That's a morally horrible thing to do. Mm-hmm. I gave no reason for it. There's no justification. It's just a horrible thing to do. And then then afterwards, I give you $5,000 and say, here's some compensation for doing that, right? Right. That $5,000 doesn't make what I did morally good, right? It just compensates you for the pain that you've gone through and for the moral badness of my action, right? The only way that it could make my punching you in the face morally good as a moral justification is if you use very strict consequentialist ethics, which is to say the morality of a given action comes about from the consequences it obtains, right? But Christians don't like consequentialism because you don't need God for that moral value system. William Lane Craig calls it a terrible ethic, right? So therefore, you cannot use heaven as a moral justification for any morally bad actions that God does or allows on earth. is not good enough. Heaven is compensation. It is not moral justification. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. But of course, they'll say you did do God wrong. But that's the problem, right? So you're born into an existence where you're automatically an autopilot to do God wrong. No choice in the matter. You didn't pick to be born, right? You're not like you're born into this, as the church doctrine has it. So you can tell the kind of arguments we're dealing with. But yeah, anyway, I agree.
So yeah, on all theodicies generally are, so talking about consequentialism. So again, theists don't like consequentialism because it's a secular moral value system. You don't need God. You just need to evaluate the consequences of a given action. Now, there are loads of different types of consequentialism. It is not as simple as one might think. There are like intentions might come into it. It might be consequences over time. It might be a rule of thumb consequentialism or act consequentialism. Loads of different types. I won't go into the long grass of that. However, just remember that Christians don't like consequentialism. However, every single theodicy is morally consequentialist. If you're saying evil happens, and we're going to explain evil because it allows us to have free will, it's the consequences of free will, or, you know, by allowing this, it allows us to have free will, then that is consequentialist. If you're saying that, you know, God sent a flood down to kill all these people to allow him to start again and do this, and the consequences of doing this is this, then that is consequentialist. Basically, every single theodicy, the soul-building theodicy, that evil and suffering exist for us to build up our souls, well, that's a consequence of the evil happening. So the evil is justified, or the suffering is justified by the ends, which is a better built up soul. Now that is morally consequentialist. So therefore you have a problem, theists, because you are using a secular moral value system to basically justify theodicies.
Shout out real quick. Yeah, Crawford, thank you for the super chat. Whoop whoop. So scholarly of me. Great content recently, both of you. Thank you, man. For real.
Thanks,
thank you,
man.
Crawford. I appreciate that.
Appreciate
and then Gnostic Informant, my buddy Neil.
Oh no, not him.
Yeah, it's him. It's him. Thanks,
I'm gonna quote him, or I'm gonna quote his ex-pastor later, so he might want to stick around.
Really? Oh, snap, Neil. You're gonna want to check it out. Why does God hide for 2,000 years, but needs to command through a book that is waived by his son?
We're going to talk about the divine hiddenness argument as well, which that is a form of. So wait around, Neil. You just stop jumping the gun.
Neil, you're the man. Go subscribe to Gnostic Informant. He just dropped an amazing video this morning with M. David Litwell. If you have not watched that video, he literally just details, like doing some comparisons between Hermes and Jesus, and showing you like they're both mediator types. They're both sons of God kind of stuff. Like there's just all sorts of cool stuff. So go check it out. Got to subscribe to my boy Neil. Thank you, Neil, for the super chat, my friend.
So just to lay out some more of the groundwork in the problem of evil. So again, theodicies are consequential. So what happens is you have generally two types of arguments to do with the problem of evil. One is a logical problem of evil, which is this argument that supposedly says that suffering and OmniGod are literally logically incoherent or inconsistent, incompatible. So in other words, it disproves God's existence by a kind of logical syllogism. But then theists have generally come back and said, no, we're not having that, because there might be a reason that such suffering exists. And this is generally known as skeptical theism, which is the idea that we don't know the mind of God. God moves in mysterious ways. There could be a reason why so much suffering and evil exists. Really, really common. Okay, so this then becomes the evidential problem of evil. The evidential problem of evil is one to do with probability. So it's like, well let's look at the kind of world. Okay, we've got two hypotheses, right? God exists or God doesn't exist. And then you look at the world, you look at all the data points, you say, looking at the world, what does this data better accord with? Which hypothesis does this better support? And you present, these are called abductive arguments, inferences to the best explanation. You say, well, actually, it looks like atheism is definitely the best explanation for all the data points. Now, it's not a disproval of God, and it's not a logical syllogism. It's just how we can build up a probability analysis. Sorry, did you want to come in with a super chat and a comment there?
No, God just commented, I'm having popcorn while you all debate my existence.
Prove it, God. Prove that you exist.
Reveal yourself. Well, I did through a chat, duh.
Brilliant. Thanks, God, though.
I do have a super chat, though. Let's give Chinny a shout out. It is interesting that you
legend.
use Christian arguments to argue against the Christian points of view. Everyone, including non-Christians, can critically examine what is in the Bible. Keep up the great work.
And actually, so that's and thanks, Chinny. Chinny's such a wonderful person. So great supporter of my channel and yours.
Awesome.
So, but as a Christian, you know, he makes some really interesting points and also admits some, you know, there are some tough areas of that belief system. But these arguments, all of the arguments I think I'll be presenting today, I will use the word Christians, but actually I mean theists generally, because actually, if you believe in the Islamic God, if you believe that your God is an omni-God, then actually this should all, you know, be relevant for you as well.
And then also we've got Nidimus. Thank you so much for the super chat. The Capturing Christianity Suffer Shuffle. We know the reason, too. We don't really know.
Well, so this is really interesting. So skeptical theism is a problem because you say we don't know the mind of God. And yet at all other times they say we know the mind of God. God does this because of that. And God does it. So it's like, hang on. Like on the one hand, you're saying you really know the mind of God. And on the other hand, you say you can't know the mind of God. And then you just kind of throw up your hands and say, oh, I don't really know, but it could be a possibility. And you get, so this is what a fallacy that Richard Carrier coined called the possibility ergo probability fallacy. And this is one of the most pervasive hermeneutics, or not hermeneutics, one of the heuristics or like mechanisms that theists use. Possibility ergo probability. It's possible, therefore it's probable. So here you go. Well, it's possible that God could have a reason for this. And you say, well, there's a possibility. It might only be 0.0001%. And then you go, it's possible. Then you go, actually, I think it's probable. Actually, I think it's true. And so you get this, you say, okay, I agree, it could be possible. But now you're thinking it's true. And you've jumped from this possibility to a probability to a certainty. Yeah. And that's a really common thing that you see.
Thank you, Nidimus and Chendi, for the super chats. Awesome.
So this is to say that you know, suffering isn't logically consistent with an all-loving God, but it doesn't really support an all-loving God. And so imagine that Derek produces a house, like a playhouse for his children, right? He's got 10 children. He produces his playhouse. And you say, right, before we do anything, and we know that Derek is an all-loving father, right? He is the most loving father. Derek is love. He produces this Wendy house, this big playhouse. And you think, right, if I know that Derek is the most loving father I could ever imagine, he's infinite love, then what would just intuitively, what would I imagine this house to look like? And you'd say, well, it's going to be full of love and fun and enjoyment and blah, blah, blah. And then if later on someone comes back and says, well, actually, so one of the children got Ebola straight away because there was Ebola laced all over one of the rooms in this playhouse and then started bleeding from their eye sockets and died horribly. And then another one got cancer, and then people were arguing because there was an unfair distribution in one of the rooms of sweets, of candies. And so, you know, the children started arguing and killing each other and blah, blah, blah. And you say, right, okay, now I'm looking at this data. Is this what I predicted from the beginning? Like, is this really like this house, which is laced with Ebola and razor blades and like guns? And you're like, is this actually like what I predict from an all-loving father? Right. And no, it's not. So therefore, I don't think Derek is an all-loving father, right? So when you look at the world and all the kind of evil, it's like, yeah, you can try and explain it away. It's not logically impossible that an all-loving God exists, but really, is this what we would predict? No. And this, I think this favors definitely an atheistic hypothesis. Again, does that make sense?
Yeah, that made plenty of sense. Yeah, I was thinking that, but also applying it to the real world. And of course, what they will do is try to run to some, it was created perfectly. The playhouse didn't have Ebola. The playhouse didn't have razor blades. The playhouse didn't have guns and knives, and they weren't starving and fighting over food because there wasn't enough to distribute, and there wasn't all this stuff. But it was man who messed this thing up.
Where's the positive evidence of that? So yeah, you could say that, but where's the positive evidence of that? There is none. There's literally none. In fact, there's negative evidence. There's evidence that wasn't the case, right? We've got evidence that carnivorousness existed before humans existed, right? So I can present evidence, but actual positive evidence against that position. But also I can say, if you do believe that, and if I accept that that's the case, like, God designed, and we talked about this in the previous episodes, that if God designed and created humanity from scratch, we are fully contingent beings. We had no say in our creation, but God had full foreknowledge of what would happen and created us this way anyway. And so think back to that playhouse. If God knew what would happen in that house, that one of your kids would get Ebola and die, and the other ones would fight and go, but created that house anyway, and actually created the children knowing exactly what they'd do. If God created us as contingent beings, knowing that we would fail and we would have to fall, and so therefore all the bad stuff that happens is a result of us failing, but he designed us in such a way that would happen, then actually God has full moral culpability for that.
Yeah, that makes, or start over, like don't even do it to begin with, really is the point. Yeah. So if I was a loving father and I knew that was going to happen, you'd have to take away my omniscience. I couldn't have my all-knowingness be there, and yet you could still call me that all-loving father in light of all those things.
The only way you could do that is to just come up with some weird contrived reason such that house is the all-loving house that it doesn't look like it is. Somehow it's not logically impossible that there isn't in some way all loving eventually. But again, it's a probability thing here. Yeah, okay, you could come up with that reason, but absent of those reasons, you can't just promise me there's a reason. This is skeptical theism. You can't just say, oh, there could be a reason. That's it. I'm off down the pub. Like, no, hang on. Wait. You've got to do a better job than that. So at least give me something more than a promissory note that there might be some reason. That's a possibility, ergo probability. That's not good enough. So I would err on the side of, atheism being a much more probable hypothesis to explain the data.
Thank you. We got a quick super chat here. Yep. Sentinel Apologetics. Rob, I always call him Rob Lowe. Rob Rowe. The Bible never says the creation was perfect.
Yeah, so this gets, and we talked about this in previous episodes. So again, I refer you back to that where we treated this in greater depth. But just to say that if God is perfect, then God's creations must be in some sense perfect. As in, like a perfect creator wouldn't create imperfectly, because then he wouldn't be a perfect creator. So therefore, the question is this? So this just comes necessarily from God's perfect characteristics. So either this world is perfect now, that's slightly hard to argue for, or this is a journey towards perfection eventually, right? Which is generally what Christians and theists will argue, to some kind of progressive revelation or some kind of progression to a perfect state. But the problem is, if God is to be all loving, there can be no gratuitous suffering. So not even one unit of pain can be gratuitous. Right, so me stubbing my toe in the morning has to have some reason for that stubbing to be there in light of an all-loving God. Otherwise, God is not all-loving. If that stubbing of my toe or that genocide, anywhere in between, is unnecessary, is gratuitous, then God is not all-loving. So therefore, this creation has to be, if it's not perfect now, it has to be the perfect way of getting to perfection. Do you understand what I mean? This has to be the optimal manner that we can get to the perfect state, which means that there can be, so when 240,000 people died in the tsunami in 2004, it had to be 240,000 people. One person less meant, if there's one person less, then it would have been one person less. In other words, if we could have got to that perfect state with 239,999 people dying, then 239,999 people would have died. Do you know what I mean? So that 240,000 people died has to be perfect. It has to be optimal in order to get to this perfect position. Because if you could get to that perfect position with less suffering, an all-loving God would do that. I don't know if that makes sense.
I get what you're saying. I know that no matter what you say, though, I don't think it's going to suffice for people who are probably in that bubble. You know what I mean?
But then they are logically inconsistent. If they don't agree with the logic there, they need to show how that is logically problematic.
Rob's back again. And thank you, Rob, for the super chat. An omni creator cannot create an omni creation.
We're not an omni creation. I don't understand that. An omni creator has to create the most loving thing, the thing most lovingly. If God is all loving, like there can be no gratuitous suffering. So And as soon as you've got that, everything else follows that I talked about earlier. So there can be no gratuitous suffering. End of. If there is gratuitous suffering, God is not omni. That's just what omnibenevolence means. It means that this is the problem of evil. And the theists would admit this, that they would just say that there is no gratuitous suffering. All suffering is necessary. And they then present theodicies to show they are necessary for us to have free will. The suffering is necessary for us to build theodicies. Now, we could talk about Stephen Mason here. So Stephen Mason says ordinary morality basically presupposes atheism. So he takes this and he talks about something called theological individualism. So he says, and this is defined as necessarily, God permits undeserved, involuntary human suffering only if such suffering ultimately produces a net benefit for the sufferer. And you could argue if it's not for the sufferer, it's for the humanity as a whole. So in other words, this is just basically saying that all suffering presents a net benefit eventually, because otherwise you wouldn't have that suffering. So he then presents a really interesting argument towards what I call moral paralysis. So he says, imagine someone, an old granny is on the other side of the road and is getting beaten up by some little kid, right? And you're on this side of the road and you're saying, right, that little kid is beating up that granny. But I know for a fact, supposedly as a theist, I know that that any suffering, including the suffering she's having now, will beget a necessary net benefit. So therefore, if I was to stop that suffering, if I was to go over and stop that kid beating up that granny, I would stop this net benefit taking place. So he then presents his argument that actually, if you really are serious about the problem of evil and the theodicies, this should lead to moral paralysis, because you are stopping the net benefits by stopping suffering. So therefore, you should just walk around and not help anyone and not do anything, because there can be no gratuitous suffering. So no matter what happens, there is no gratuitous suffering and there is net benefit. So,
interesting note. I just think this is kind of funny. I would love to get the next super chat here with Rob real quick. But just to point out, when Paul makes that statement about I've been whipped in his personal letters, like we're not running to Acts or somewhere else, in Paul's actual letters, he talks about how many times he's beaten and all this, because he's kind of wanting to flex his credentials as an apostle and how serious they should take him. But he talks about how he's filling up the suffering that was lacking in Christ, like Christ's suffering. That Paul's suffering was somehow, hey, every time I'm getting beaten at the synagogue or persecuted is all good brownie points and filling up the suffering that was lacking in Christ. And it's just really interesting. I wonder if Paul was seeing this happening, or if Paul is participating in this suffering himself. He wouldn't probably have he'd probably be like, this is what is supposed to happen, even though he probably wouldn't like it. Who likes getting hurt? I don't know. Some people maybe, but you see what I'm saying?
I guess the question is how soon, or when did the OmniGod iteration of God develop? Because we talked about this before, the actually, originally you had an understanding of God, like, God and Anatomy by Dr. Francesca Stavropoulos.
Grab it.
Yeah, so the understanding that God was like a very anthropomorphic entity that then went through a transformation over time, and after the Bible, to now, where now God is this abstract entity, this omni-God that exists outside of time and space. And the people who now believe that have to now try and harmonize that, marry that with this idea of God popping up actually in the Hebrew Bible with body parts and showing his butt cheeks and all this stuff going on as she shows in that book. And those two iterations, those two versions of God don't really cohere very well.
No. Highly recommend. I'm going to be interviewing her next week, and I'm going to make it live. So you'll be able to interact with that as well. I like to make it live because it's almost like that saying in the Bible where it talks about hiding the light under a lampstand. Like, why wouldn't I want you to join me on the fun? Bring your questions. But yeah, mixing that ancient Near Eastern deity with the philosophical divine, that we find later evolves is interesting. Rob sends, and thank you, Rob, from Sentinel Apologetics. Can you hypothesize God's method in perfecting it? And I think he's talking about creation.
Well, whatever God's method is in perfecting creation, like if we're not perfect now, then it has to be like, I'm just going to repeat myself. Like whatever he does, whatever God does, has to be the most loving way of doing it. So whatever way God has of perfecting us, and we can talk about even why he'd want to do that and what's the point if he knows in advance what everything anyway. That process has to be the optimally loving process, and there can still be no gratuitous pain or suffering. So whatever the perfecting method is, you know, if you're talking about like an artist sculpting this sculpture to get it to this perfect state, imagine the sculpture was like somehow sentient. Like there could be no pain in sculpting. Every bit of perfecting, every shaving off of that can cause no pain to the sculpture, or no unnecessary pain. Every bit has to be necessary. And that's all you can say. I mean, you can come up with all sorts of contrived reasons why God might be wanting creation and wanting it to go like this or do this. But if you believe in OmniGod, it still has to entail no gratuitous suffering.
Thank you so much. Yeah, unless your God's not all loving, or is not like absolutely working everything because of love, then you'd have to say, well, that attribute doesn't work in everything they do. I just want to mention real quick to Carrie, I wish this were the case. I know you said that you argue that self-improvement is the point of all religions, not whose God is the best, but within the Bible itself, there are battles between gods. Literally, the Egyptian gods are being destroyed in the Exodus because the Israelite gods are better. Baal is fighting against Yahweh, and Elijah's like literally mocking their other god to say our God is better. So I wish this were the case. This isn't the case though. And that's just the way the text is. It is what it is. I wish it was only about self-improvement, but.
So Sentinels just asked another thing, and welcome to the gospel, the most loving thing. So another super chat there. But see, the problem is, and we talked about this in the last episode, which is the things that the Bible doesn't say. So actually, if the gospel was the most loving thing, you would expect Jesus to say, right, first of all, guys, slavery is bad. Just because I know in advance, as God, I know in advance that the Bible is going to be used to countenance slavery for 1,900 years of the last 2,000 years. Like this is me now, but Jesus then would be saying, right, for the next 1,900 years, the Bible is going to be used, whether you could say rightly or wrongly, it doesn't really matter. It will be used to countenance slavery. So therefore, just for the record now, have you got this, Peter? Have you got this, guys, with your etching this on your slates? Because I know we didn't have dictaphones, and I know you're really accurately recording my speech. But I just want you to record, slavery is bad. It's really, really bad. But Jesus doesn't say that. So straight away, just that alone, I mean, you know, reading Hector Avalos's, I'm serializing his book on my own channel at the moment, Slavery, Abolitionism, and the
I got it
Ethics
somewhere.
of Biblical Scholarship, right? So, I mean, just on slavery alone, like the argument that slavery is used for most of history, the Bible is used to justify slavery for most of our recent history, is argument enough that God doesn't exist, in my opinion. That is an absolute, that's a deal breaker for me, right? So someone could come along and say, with all due respect, Sentinel, someone could come along and say, well, welcome to the gospel, it's the most loving thing. No, it's not. If Jesus doesn't outlaw slavery there and then allows that very book and the Old Testament to be used to justify slavery for the next 1,900 years, that ain't the most loving. Sorry.
No,
you're beginning to rant because actually that slavery, the whole slavery thing, I've really come to realize just recently in reading that book how damning of an indictment of the Bible as a whole, the whole slavery thing is, especially given God's foreknowledge. If God knows in advance that his book, his revelation, was going to be used to justify slavery, then man, he could have done something about that, but didn't.
Thank you, Sentinel, for that super chat. I really appreciate it. Seriously.
So we're moving on. Like I haven't even started my arguments yet, but this is
that's why today I'm gonna. I hope everybody understands. I am taking kind of a last time I blabbered with you, and we barely moved on though. So I'm here to kind of like
tango. We danced a beautiful tango, buddy.
We did, but I feel like I'll be like a bouncing board here and there. You know what I mean? Like I want to let you at least get through your arguments and stuff, and then of course let the audience ask questions through super chats, whatever they want to do. So
sure thing. So the first argument, well, actually, all of those are arguments. I mean, it's all expressing you've got to do that work on the problem of evil because it's such a huge area. So that's all in the preamble to the part 4 of the book. And the next chapter is natural evil shows God's shadier side. And natural evil is super important because actually, so what happens is like I've said, the theist presents all these theodicies to explain away suffering. And the free will theodicy, the soul building theodicy, the kind of perfect world theodicy, all these things that generally exist around the idea that it's humans' fault or it's for humans that these things are happening. But when you start presenting natural evil, like natural suffering, like plate tectonics, tsunamis, when you're talking about carnivorousness, when you're talking about animal suffering, then actually this has nothing to do with humans. Humans could not exist, and that's still happening needs explaining because you've got actual genuine suffering that has nothing to do with humans. And how do we explain that in light of OmniGod? And so therefore you get some people saying that the natural evil are the natural evil arguments, problem of evil arguments, are the strongest arguments in the problem of evil sort of paradigm. Did you, as a Christian, did you ever think about animal suffering? Was this something like, was it not on your radar? Or
I knew of it, but it was like one of those things I did not really put much thought into. When I say thought, I mean actually dwell on that and consider why are there certain species whose existence is to be consumed by another species. It's not that just animals die and we all die. That's bad enough, right? That death is a thing. It's another when you know certain animals exist as the food chain for other animals. Without that, they would not exist.
So the existence of certain animals necessitates the pain and suffering of other animals
automatically, because they're part of that. It's like almost like what is the technical scientific term for certain plants that exist and they wouldn't exist without that certain animal, and the animal cannot exist apart from that certain plant. It's like what happened to the
symbiotic relationships. So yes. You get symbiosis.
Without it, it doesn't work. And this is the same thing with the food chain, in particular animal species. And what do they have to do to consume that animal? They have to, break their neck or chomp down, eat them alive, rip their flesh apart, whatever. Are we going to pretend that that's not evil? There's nothing wrong about that. There's nothing like that we would look at and go, ill, this is not good.
One of the previous arguments, I think, earlier in the book, because it was a design argument, so we covered it in the first episode of this series, right? And it's relevant here, is the argument from photosynthesis. So the argument is, why did God create carnivorousness? Right? Why didn't God create us or any animal to be able to generate the energy that they need to exist on a daily basis just through photosynthesis? Now, you could say, well, actually, we can't generate enough of our energy just from the sun with how the laws of physics works now. Well, God can play around with the laws of physics, or God could do perpetual miracles. It's literally no skin off God's nose. Absolutely not an issue for God to do. He's omnipotent to do perpetual miracles all the time, or design existence such that we just generate our energy from the sun. But instead, a huge number of animals generate their energy from eating and killing other animals. And that therefore needs to be explained in light of the fact that God is supposedly all loving. Again, what does that data point, what does all this animal suffering in the world better support? Atheism or theism? Just without anything else, atheism or theism.
Right. Something to think about.
Yeah, so animal suffering as a result, and I'm quoting from my book, page 117, as a result is seen as many thinkers as the strongest challenge to the defense of the problem of evil. Here is an example of such an argument that could be formulated. So this is a syllogism to show what's called the Darwinian problem of evil. So this is called the Darwinian problem of evil. 1, God is omnipotent, omniscient, and wholly good. So 1, OmniGod, right? 2, the evil of extensive animal suffering exists. So animal suffering exists, and it's suffering, and it's bad. Necessarily, God can actualize an evolutionary perfect world. Necessarily, God can actualize an evolutionary perfect world only if God does actualize an evolutionarily perfect world. 5, necessarily, God actualized an evolutionary perfect world. Right. So I'll explain all this. So basically, number 5, which is necessarily God actualized an evolutionary perfect world, as in this is this world, doesn't work with the fact that suffering exists. So the fact that we've got suffering and God could create a world in which evolution produced was much more perfect and produced no pain and suffering. God could do that. And you would do that if he's all loving, but God hasn't done that because we can see animals suffering. So we've got issues. So 5 follows from 3 and 4. We have a contradiction since 5 and 2 cannot both be true. So it appears that 1 is false. In other words, God is not omni-God, right? So that's how the syllogism goes. And I'll just read a quick explanation because it needs a little bit of unpicking. The argument is to say that God could predict the mechanisms of evolution and design one in which animal suffering is minimized. The scenario can be called an evolutionarily perfect world. We could imagine a scenario where God could put in place an evolutionary system whereby, for example, just before a gazelle is given a killing bite by a lion, a gene is expressed that naturally tranquilizes the gazelle, or some such similar situation. But this appears not to be the case. Instead, we have extensive animal suffering that is hard-baked into the evolutionary system and world. So this really becomes a design argument as much as a problem of evil argument, which is that God has designed, just God can't be all loving. There's just no way God can be all loving given evolution and given carnivorousness and the way that animals interact.
So I'm going to play the Calvinist that was in me to tell you how I tried to solve this.
Sure.
And I used to have the free will, kind of the typical Christian worldview. And when I became a Calvinist, I was trying at least to swallow this massive pill that you're describing here. And I even had a bone to pick with Calvinists about this. And this is the two will hypothesis that God has, something just fell, that God has two wills, a revealed will and a hidden will. Within Calvinism, everything that happens to happen ever was all part of God's will, right? A lot of Christians will actually say this too. Even non-Calvinists will somewhat say it was all part of God's will. But then they have this prescriptive will, which is written in, 10 commandments and what thou shalt not do, or, little things like Moses telling Pharaoh, let my people go. God tells him to go tell Pharaoh, let my people go. But God hardens Pharaoh's heart. And then you're like, does God really want the Israelites to be slaves? Or does God really want the people to be let go? What does God really want? And to understand what God's moral compass is in this is difficult of a problem to do. So I came to this conclusion as a Calvinist where I said, everything that happens, suffering, good, evil, it's all God's will. It's all God's will. God doesn't have two wills. He tells mortals, here's your rules. But God does everything, and everything that happens is his will. Which means I was trying to accept the notion of Isaiah 45 where it says, I create light, I create darkness, I create good, I create evil. I, the Lord, do all things. I make good, I make evil. So I would not have said as a Calvinist that God is all loving.
Yeah, I mean, but see that.
You see what I'm trying to get at?
Yeah, but so what you do is you have to drop one of the omnis, which
Exactly.
is fine. Like, the point of this book is to say that either God doesn't exist or God is not omni, but you just can't have those properties coexisting. And you can come up like the Calvinist does with contrived ways of getting around some of these problems, but you have to drop one of the omnis. And
I was playing within the box, as you could see.
Yeah, and when God's will is supreme, because at the end of the day, being omnipotent, God could do anything, but doesn't do certain things. So anything that happens is allowed to happen. So the omissive will, and we'll come to talk about this a little bit later in one of the other arguments, but the idea that there is really no difference between omissive will and active will, if you like, which is like I am making that happen or I'm letting that happen, because at the end of the day, God designed everything and created everything knowing it would happen anyway. So omissive will really is active will anyway, in the sense of like, I predicted that, I know it's going to happen, I'm still going to create it anyway. So yeah,
that's interesting. You want to hit these super chats real quick here?
Do it.
Rob, thank you for the super chat. It says, nonsense. Why did Darwin use Acts 17:26 to justify monogenesis? His family made that black emblem. Am I not a brother? From biblical anthropology.
I'm not sure what any of that means. So I do apologize. But I would just say that nonsense doesn't just do justice to any of the arguments that I actually presented. So I would say that how would you argue against the Darwinian problem of evil? Why is evolution not perfect in terms of being an all-loving mechanism? Why is that? And all that someone like Sentinel can do, all they can do is appeal to skeptical theism, which is like, yeah, there could be a reason, because of course they don't know the reason, and all they do is end up making up reasons. It's just pure post hoc, ad hoc rationalizations to try and maintain God and Jesus and the Bible up here. That's all theology does. It's like, I have to have this up here. So everything I do with my mind is maintaining the supremacy of these ideas and the perfection of these ideas. And so, and going back to the slavery book of Hector Avalos, that's exactly what he shows that all the theologians and biblical scholars are doing in their justification of slavery and their biblical hermeneutics is doing that. They're just keeping that up there. And then my entire methodology is supremely dishonest in a sense, because it just needs to maintain the moral supremacy of these ideas.
I really appreciate the super chat. The next one's really interesting. I always enjoy hearing this. Vaguely agnostic, an omni creates a light source that causes cancer. Without the sun, we wouldn't have anything. Yeah,
he did say this in our previous one of our previous ones, I think, but he said it in one of my ones. So VA is a legend. Thank you, VA. Yeah. But why create the source of energy for all of us? If we're eating meat to get our energy, actually those meat eaters ate another herbivore, and so the producers at the beginning of the food web or food chains are deriving their energy from the sun, i.e. plants. And so therefore the sun is the source of almost all our energy apart from geothermal stuff, right? So it's the source of nuclear is a source of predominantly all our energy that provides life, and it also gives us cancer if we get too much of it. Like, if it is that, again, as a data point, would you predict that? If you started with the right, I'm imagining this, I've got nothing in my mind, but I've got, an all-loving God, and I'm going to think about what the all-loving God would create. So go back to the house analogy with you, Derek. Mm-hmm. So you're like, I've got this lovely little Wendy house for my 10 children. And again, I've laced it with Ebola and razor blades and guns. But I've also put a couple of lights in there so everyone can see, but, if they keep the light on for more than, 4 hours in the day, they'll all get cancer. You're like, okay, is that really the sign of a loving father, Derek? Is Derek really the loving father that people claim he is? No. And I think that's a really lovely little argument.
It's just interesting. Thank you for being a member of MythVision, Vaguely. I really appreciate that. Constellation Pegasus, thank you for the super chat. God is real, and the Jehovah's Witnesses have the truth. Why can't you two silly ones believe that? He's joking, of course.
Yeah, no, I did /S. Bit of sarcasm. Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, if you're a Jehovah's Witness, that isn't sarcasm. That is truth.
That is to them, yeah.
And actually, a bit of a plug for me. I've got a couple of ex-Jehovah's Witnesses coming on my channel for a chat soon. So we'll be looking into JWs. Always fun. I love it when they ring the doorbell. I just can't get to the door quick enough because I love a humdinger or an argument.
Oh, man. Thank you, Constellation, for the super chat. Good to see you in the chat. JC, thank you for the 20. Key difference. Pain, suffering, period, versus gratuitous. Pain equals brain interpretation of human or social body harms, sensors, and vital to survival. Pain is not a bad thing per se. Evolution explains it.
Yes. So which is interesting. Yes. So again, we're talking about inferences, abductive arguments, inferences to the best explanation. So when you look at, and this is Paul Draper's made this argument, I think, about evolution. Again, does evolution better support atheism or theism when pain doesn't necessarily accord with things that are morally bad, and pleasure doesn't necessarily accord with things that are morally good? And those ideas are predicted by atheism and naturalism, but they're not predicted by theism. So again, if you're a theist and you are a theistic evolutionist, you would beforehand predict that evolution would at least have in its mechanisms that pleasure would correlate or be caused by things that are morally good, and pain would correlate exactly with things that are morally bad. But that's not the case. And so you've just got this weird scenario. So yes, pain is really useful. We can explain it naturalistically, but of course that's naturalism. You know, pain and pleasure don't have that kind of predictability within the theistic framework, I would argue. So yeah, I'm not sure about the first bit, pain, suffering, period versus gratuitous. I'm not sure what that means, and I know it's difficult because you've got to get stuff in with the only amount of characters you have. But but hopefully that's kind of answered a little bit what you said.
Thank you, JC, for that 20. I really appreciate that. Abel, thank you for the 20 as well. World of possibilities perhaps is where we are living. So perhaps the Bible and Quran, by stating one God, it opened the universe. It made it react to another set of possibilities, possibly even reincarnation, a kind of God.
I mean, I'm not 100% sure what's going on there, but basically there's a lot of possibilities, and you can present anything as a possibility. It could be that aliens are going to come down and do X, Y, and Z in 5 years' time, and that could be part of God's plan. You know, you can construct any kind of thing that fits the data, but that's a real post hoc rationalization attempt. So, you know, I would just, what does the data tell us, and which hypothesis does it best support? I don't know if I probably haven't answered that at all. I'm struggling to fully comprehend exactly what's going on there. But yeah, you know, it could be that reincarnation is a thing, and it could be that X, Y, and Z. But again, probabilities.
Abel, I appreciate you for the 20, and I'm glad you're still alive. In the other story, your brother Cain killed you. So I'm thankful that you're still here, my friend. Shadow Veins, Jonathan. Oh, 666, by the way. Jonathan has put into words the way I have felt about the Christian God for years. There are just so many problems with the Omni-God. Thank you both.
Hey, Shadow Vein, you might be interested in a book that's available at all good bookstores.
Shameless plug.
Yep.
Batteries not included. But seriously. Thank you so much.
But seriously, Shadow Vein, seriously.
Yeah, his works are really good. I always enjoy talking with Jonathan, and your accent makes you like you
sound
can be
more intelligent
rude.
than I really am.
No, not only that, but like you can be rude, and it wouldn't be rude. It would be like, oh, he's sweet. Listen to him bitch at me right now. You know, like it's.
He swears so nicely.
Oh, he's such a nice guy. Listen to him. Constellation Pegasus, thank you for the super chat. Defective Son. What about a defective universe that will eventually genocide mankind? Was
Really
Adam
good.
and Eve's sin so bad to cause that? Great point.
So this is a great point to do with fine-tuning arguments. So the fine-tuning argument is that this is almost like the Goldilocks. You know, this universe is just right to produce life. It's like, actually, this universe is far more likely to cause death. It's far easier to die than it is to live. And in fact, you could argue that this universe is fine-tuned for death. And also, you could argue from the size of the universe as to be just utterly wasteful or weird, and the amount of time it's taken for humanity to get here, 13.7 billion years or whatever. So there are loads of arguments to do with the creation of the universe and black holes and the size that would favor, again, what hypothesis does it favor? I would say that the universe, the size of the universe, and the death-reaping like characteristics of the universe better support atheism and naturalism over theism. Great point.
Thank you. We're caught up.
Yeah, we're caught up. Good stuff. Keep them coming. So now we're on to chapter 18. God, where is God hiding? So these are divine hiddenness arguments.
I love this one, by the way. Well, the theodicy stuff too, but I mean, like, I really, really love this. This is one of the things that just gets me, but go ahead.
So there's several ways of looking at divine hiddenness. There's a kind of more obvious way of like God's been on holiday for 2,000 years. There's a great song by Cashapp on their album Happy Hollow, which is rare that you get bands that produce an album that are just purely atheistic or agnostic or like looking at whether God exists or not. Happy Hollow by Cashapp it does that. And one of their songs is called Retreat, where they're just saying, well, God's been on holiday for 2,000 years. Where have you been? We've been getting into wars in your name and blah, blah, blah. And I just love the idea that God has just like pulled out the telephone plug and just sodded off for 2,000 years. And like everyone's going like, God, hello, God, hello. You know, where are you? Like he used to come down and like kill people for looking the wrong way or dropping the ark or doing random things.
Spilling
like,
your seed on the ground or
getting involved 10 a penny, just like, oh, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, all during the biblical times. And as soon as the Bible was written, God's like, do you know what? I'm spent. I'm off for a holiday into the Bahamas or like the to a different universe or something. And then it's just effectively hidden. So that's
you could make the same argument also, by the way, in the Greek epics like Homer. Like here is, Achilles, right, fighting. He's literally fighting. Here's these gods that are there present in these narratives. Where are they at now? Where did they die? Did they go to Mount Olympus and just leave us forsaken? Or who are they whispering to at this point? Like I just wanted to point it out. Like you could do this.
Oh yes. So let's again inference to the best explanation. Does this better support the atheistic hypothesis or the theistic hypothesis? The fact that God's disappeared pretty much looks like we made God up, wrote a book about God, and then that God, after that book was extracted from that parochial place, that God didn't really appear again, apart from some people that imagine it did. But then it turns out that every religion has people that imagine their God has revealed stuff to them. So, that's a bit of a problem. So that's one form of the divine hiddenness argument. But actually, when it's developed by people like J.L. Schellenberg, it's more to do with what he calls non-resistant non-believers. And this is a really interesting idea. And we did talk a little bit about this before in terms of like Amazonian tribespeople and what explains that they had no access to God's revelation. So I'll bring these two ideas together. So what is a non-resistant non-believer? It is someone who, if they did know about, let's say, the Judeo-Christian God, if they did know about the Judeo-Christian God, they would believe in that God, and they would be great believers, arguably, right? But they just don't know about that God, so they are non-believers. So how is that fair? So if God is all loving, he'll give everyone an equal and fair access to the knowledge of God and therefore God's love and union with God in earthly life. Because of course, belief in God must have to be serve some kind of good purpose. Otherwise, there's no point in believing in God. So believing in God must be some kind of good. But if you're saying that the vast majority of people over history and time, history and geography haven't accessed God's love and couldn't access God's love, then you've got a bit of a problem here. So these are like non-resistant non-believers. But then it goes even further to say, well, then you've got people who are suffering. So the Nagasawa, I think he's a theologian called Nagasawa, talks about in the 17th century, you had Christian persecution or persecution of Christians in 17th century Japan. And you had all these people being horribly persecuted for their Christian beliefs, but God didn't turn up and help them. All the prayers that they gave and so these are not only non-resistant non-believers, these are actual believers who are saying, help us, we are being persecuted. And God was like, oh, I'm still on holiday. Oh, I've got another couple of thousand years to go now. And didn't come and help these people. And so therefore you've got a divine hiddenness. Then what explains that hiddenness?
And you know what ends up happening? And I kind of feel like it's almost like a slap in the face sometimes. Let's take 9/11, for example. I remember when Ravi Zacharias used to give lectures on this back when I was still in Christianity and an apologist and whatnot. And he would talk about, where is God? Where was God on 9/11 was the question, right? And he was close to everybody. Even the people dying in that building, like this was his point, where God was there, present in all of this, etc. Which is a
mere assertion with no evidence, but yeah,
right. But then what really becomes kind of a slap in the face is when you get this testimony by someone who was like, I was right there at ground zero. The building started falling and I ran and I actually escaped the destruction while the thousands in the building were melting alive and being crushed. This lucky person, one person, and this is somehow a testimony to verify their God actually was present to help them, while the thousands that are in that building there are melting and burning alive, or being crushed and suffocated, or dying of suffocation from the dust. You name it, the horrific suffering that took place. And you hear like this single testimony. It was like, he was there for me. What about all of them? And what, or that kind of stuff becomes, it actually aggravates a little. It's like I found my car keys kind of idea. I prayed, I found my car keys, but the person in Africa is dying right now from some incurable disease or something, and they didn't have any say. They were born into it or whatever. You know what I mean?
It's the idea that I've had a remission from cancer. Thank you, God. God has enabled that to happen. It's like, yeah, but what about all the other people whose cancers haven't gone into remission? Right. You know, it's exactly the same thing. Or you have someone that's come out of a 13-hour surgery involving, you know, 15 different medical professionals with thousands of man hours of training that's built on the shoulders of thousands of years of science, right? And then, you know, this person's life is saved through this life-saving surgery.
Saved me.
And then, you know, the husband's outside, the wife's outside, and says, "Oh, thank God for that. It's a miracle." It's like, and the doctors are there going, hello, do you see me? Do you see us? Like, we've just been working on this guy for 13 hours. Like, right. That's what saved his life. So, and it's the idea that, yeah, you cherry pick what God does and is responsible for, and forget the fact that all these other people have died in exactly the same scenarios.
Yeah, but in that case of like divine hiddenness, he's hidden for everyone else. And the one argument I can imagine them saying is I used to say it myself, well, you'll find out after you die. Like, God will make it clear after. It's amazing. Like, God is right not in the cloud, you know, used to be behind the cloud, but now he's outside of space and time. So it's an unfalsifiable assumption that you are just making a claim of. And then they want to jump to near-death experiences and stuff like that to try to validate things like this. Like, it's all like on this very thin thread of ideas that everything rests on. And while I get it, I'm not here to like make everybody not think that way, but at least you can understand why we're not starting with that. We're actually trying to look at things and go, if we are alone and all we have is us, I want to learn how to cope with that and figure that out, and how to better our society, knowing what the facts are without necessarily creating the myths that are actually creating, I would say, psychological abuses, like it was for me. My natural inclinations as a human being and the things that I just normally feel, I'm having to fight those desires and fight against my flesh, and the endless mental torture of these ideas and my existence. Hate this world so you can gain life. If you love the world, you don't love God. And what comes with the world? The flesh, everything that is this. And you see why Paul was so resistant on even wanting people to have marriage. And like, if you gotta marry so you're not lusting, okay, do it. But like, you see what I'm saying? Like, it's just, what the hell's going on? So I'm much, this is where the Christians will say, well, that way you can sin. You want to be able to sin. That's why. No, I don't think it's wrong to feel guilt for being a human being. This is something that I've come to realize after discovering there's so many other problems. But I had to give that little rant, man, because this is something that kind of annoys me. Thank you, Jesus. Dude, a human being did that for the last 8 hours, and you have to thank Jesus for it. And sometimes they won't even thank the doctor, you know?
Yeah, and just saying, you've allowed me to survive, but so thank you, God. But as you say, all those other thousands of people died in the same situation. Oh, you got some super chats?
I do. Constellation Pegasus, depending on what scale you use, the fine-tuning argument goes away.
Yeah. And the fine-tuning argument has got the heaps of issues, and it's very, you don't know as well. You don't know what other forms of life could exist in all sorts of other different parameters and physical laws. It's just it's. I don't want to go down a fine-tuning argument rabbit hole, because it's a huge one.
Thank you, Constellation. John Gears says, best argument against the existence of God. Duh. And I think he's talking about the fact that, where is God? I just think it is the point you bring up. If you pull up your Bible and you go, look at all the stuff God does. Okay, there are people with withered arms or no, can't see, splitting water, crazy phenomena that does not look natural in any way. We do not observe in the natural world in any way. If we saw these happen, even in the frequency we supposedly see the literature discuss these, and I'm not just talking about the Bible, because other religions have supposed miracles as well. If we saw that on a more regular basis, we wouldn't be arguing about the non-existence of God. We'd be arguing about which one's more superior, or are they all a reflection of the one true, or whatever. Like, this wouldn't even be an issue. We'd be debating something else, but we don't find that.
As Henry Hansen, just sorry, I know this is not exactly what you're talking about there, but it's Henry Hansen at the side says the universe is fine-tuned for dead planets. Exactly right. So, like, if the universe was truly fine-tuned for life, there'd be life everywhere. There's life hardly anywhere. There's life hardly anywhere. Therefore, like, if I designed anything you design, like if like
and you're his greatest creation, but most of your creation lacks what the greatest of his creation supposedly is. Anyway,
if I said to you, like, I've designed a little like rabbit hutch, right, to keep these 4 rabbits in, right, and I say, Derek, come and see my rabbit hutch, right, and I take you outside into my garden, and I show you a warehouse that stretches to the moon, right, and then that warehouse goes past the moon and blah blah blah, and right over there, and I say, look at the rabbit hutch I've built for my 4 rabbits. You're like, I've designed this specifically, perfectly for my 4 rabbits. You're like, right. That's a bit weird. It looks like you've designed it for like 8 gazillion rabbits, not 4 rabbits. So, again, like the size of this universe and the fact that there's so many dead planets.
Even to add value to that, it's not that you built all of this for more than like for a gazillion rabbits. That would be the case if all of those other barns that you had weren't absolutely inhabitable and would destroy every rabbit that came to its presence. So it's obviously not created for your rabbits. So which one makes more sense?
Yeah, exactly.
The atheistic one or the theistic one when it comes to this argument. So interesting. I'm starting to catch on to your arguments here. I'm doing better. Oh, by the way, Shannon Q is in the house. Will everybody give her a shout out and harass her since she's in the chat? Thank you, Shannon Q. I hope you don't mind. Constellation Pegasus. Physics is everything. I have no patience and will for theology debates based on a book people can't agree on what it says in the first place. God is not the author of confusion, huh? Give me a break.
And this idea that God is responsible for, either, okay, if you think that God didn't write the book, he created the world in such a way that that book would eventuate, right? So therefore, God, that is God's revelation. And if he wanted it any other way, he would have it any other way. But as you say, there's confusion. No one can agree on how atonement works, right? Literally, That's a whole reason Jesus died. Like that's like... That's the central tenet of Christianity. And yet there's all these mutually exclusive different theories of atonement. Like the lack of clarity is obscene in the Bible. And you've got, all these problems and confusion and lack of clarity that you need theologians to spend like PhD worths of time to try and unpick. And you're like, it's a massive confusion. Is that what you would expect with an all-loving God who would want as many people as possible, you would assume, to enter into a loving relationship with it? Well, no. So, there you go.
Thank you, Constellation. And the last one, Benji. Only the Buddha got it right about why we suffer.
I'm no Buddhist expert, so I'm not sure why that would be, but I'm sure that's probably wrong as well.
There's a claim. Thank you so much, Benji. I appreciate the super chat, my friend.
So a couple of syllogisms to look at non-resistant non-believers and divine hiddenness. So here's a couple of arguments. 1, if there is a God, he is perfectly loving. 2, if a perfectly loving God exists, there are no non-resistant but non-believers. 3, there are and often have been non-resistant non-believers. 4, no perfectly loving God exists. 5, there is no God. In other words, like, just the fact that there are non-resistant non-believers is an argument against God being all loving, because he wouldn't create these people in such a position that they wouldn't be able to access God's love and believe in God. So what then? We've talked about this before. It came into another argument, but someone like this was to do with the geographical distribution and historical distribution of people who don't believe in God or couldn't access God's love. So very similar. it's people like William Lane Craig have posited that, he has to argue that people have souls, and we'll talk about that a bit later. But he argues that these people who don't have access to God's love were front loaded with souls, and they were the people who would freely reject God anyway. In other words, he denies non-resistant non-believers. He said that these would be the people that would reject God, because he has to say that, because he can't. So either you say there are non-resistant non-believers, in which case you have to try and understand why God would allow non-resistant non-believers to exist, or you say there are no such thing as non-resistant non-believers. All of these people would have rejected God if they'd known about God.
Right.
That explains the kind of Amazonian tribesperson living 5,000 years ago, but it doesn't explain. So that's a non-resistant non-believers. It doesn't explain the divine hiddenness. It's a bonkers argument anyway, but it doesn't explain the believers, the actual believers who God remains hidden to. So the Christians being persecuted in 17th century Japan for their beliefs in God, and God doing nothing and running away and not being there. It doesn't answer why that would happen, that kind of divine hiddenness, but also God front loading like resistant souls into Amazonian tribespeople is a kind of weird argument.
Anything you can to make it sound reasonable is what you're going to find people like William Lane Craig try to do, to explain the problems. That's why I think he is a Molinist when it comes to free will and determinism, because he can get lost in philosophical jargon of word salad to make it work. And that's what I've noticed. I don't know if you've noticed the same thing, but
well, you've got to maintain it up there. I mean, that's what you do. The job of theology is to maintain the moral supremacy of Jesus and God and the Bible. And so you come up with any contrived argument, no matter how ridiculous it is, in order that remains up there.
Something to make a note on this whole divine hiddenness argument that you bring up is that if we're talking biblically, right, a big argument most Christians, maybe not Calvinists, but most Christians will say is that God desires and wants everyone to be saved. Like, I don't know any better way than to say that you're either unaware that you're a universalist, which means God gets what he wants, or God doesn't get what he wants, therefore God fails, therefore one of your omnis has to go. I just don't see how it's possible to say he desires and wants everyone to get saved, but they don't all get saved. Something's got to give.
If he really wanted everyone to get saved, he would design a universe in which everyone gets saved.
Right.
Like, if he really wanted that. So if you're saying God is infinite love, like God is love, go back to your house. Like if and your children, right? If you were an infinitely loving father, you would just never predict that would be the way that you would create a house. If you thought God was truly infinitely loving, this isn't the world that you would predict, not in any way, shape, or form. And we'll come on to that in terms of heaven in a little while, so I'll park that. But you see this divine hiddenness in the Bible, the Psalms and the Lamentations. Why has thou forsaken me? All these kind of ideas that there is divine hiddenness appears in the Bible, and it's an interesting one. But I think there is so again, to refer back to Nagasawa, who talked about these well, actually, I do want to say that divine hiddenness can manifest in quite a few different ways. So it can manifest those. So as I write here, but even since the development of ideas of monotheism, a single God like the Omni-God we are discussing, those who do believe frequently experience doubts, unrewarding prayers and rituals, spiritual dryness, or downright catastrophes taking place where God seems absent or non-responsive. So actually, there are loads of interesting shades of divine hiddenness where your spiritual dryness. You speak to some Christians like, I never really felt it, I wanted to feel it, or like it didn't have that altar call, never quite got that experience, because of course it's just a psychological made up kind of like generated, manipulated experience. But so I really wanted it but never quite felt it. That is an example of divine hiddenness as well. It's not just like in light of persecution and where is God, and it's not just the inability to even access God, but it's these other versions of divine hiddenness which also need to be understood.
Yeah, I've heard that a lot, and I almost, maybe because of my own experience, I can only go for my subjective experience. But when I hear a Christian say, I'd never had an experience, that's not why I'm a Christian, and they say it was the facts that convinced me, it was the evidence that convinced me, I try to give everyone a fair shake and say I think they're being honest. I have a very hard time believing there isn't something psychological or experiential that has them be a Christian. I just don't get it. Even if it's the story, some cognitive way that has them grabbed into this narrative in which they want to participate in this mythology. And the ones who say no, it was the evidence, I cannot relate at all. I only validated or tried to validate after my experience that I had, which was a social, construct in an environment where everyone's kind of petting you to make you say, you've sinned. You admit you sinned, right? Well, we got a remedy for the disease we're giving you. And now that we've given you this disease, now you have a remedy, which is Jesus. You can come down here and get your cure. By the way, you got to keep refilling that cure. If you don't, you might end up in this place where the disease is eternal. I got kind of coached into it. And I just don't see people honestly going, I was empirically investigating the data of the New Testament. I found out that Mark was actually the source for the synoptics. So really Luke and Matthew are actually utilizing Mark to create their narrative and do a little spinoff or whatever. But that still didn't deter me from the fact and evidence that Jesus really was what these mythological historical fictions are saying about him. And then Paul, he wasn't hallucinating. This was an actual literal thing. And all of this evidence was what made me believe. No, I just don't see it unless you're having some type of experience, which I think Paul even says, like, I didn't come to you with lofty words. The gospel is foolishness to the world, right? I brought something that I think just kind of went deeper. Paul's trying to bring something psychological that went deeper, not just wise, fancy, intelligible words. This was something else. So,
yeah. Rant away. I just to finish off the divine hiddenness argument. I think there's a really interesting quote here from again Nagasawa, who talks about how, and this is to do with theodicies, like in explaining why God isn't there for people suffering. This is basically it's theodicies and problem of evil. Really, it's a kind of maybe another iteration of the problem of evil. But it's the idea that we give, or theologians give, these intellectual reasons why suffering might exist. But really, does that, like someone who's being tortured, like literally tortured and going through like a week of pain being tortured, saying, God, where are you? God, where are you? That actual experiential despair and pain and suffering, does that really... Does it really cut the mustard that someone out here can say, well, it could be that it's soul building for you? In other words, there's a bit of a disparity between the experiential side of suffering and despair and the intellectual offerings of theologians to justify that suffering. And this quote speaks to that. So Nagasawa says, I maintain, however, that theodicies do not eliminate the problem of divine absence altogether because they fail to answer the experiential problem, which concerns the pain and suffering of real people. We are mistaken if we think that theodicies can eliminate the experiential problem. That, and I love this, that would perhaps be as absurd as thinking we could eliminate a toothache with an intellectual argument. So imagine saying you've got a really bad toothache and me saying, well, of course, that toothache is telling you there's pain and there's like naturalistic evolutionary reasons why that pain is useful. And you're going, yeah, fair enough. But man, this is really hurting. Right. Like, yeah, that's a wonderful explanation, but it's not really alleviating my pain here in any kind of way, meaningful way. And I think that's a really interesting observation there. And, And I said to follow on, so if you don't mind me quoting, page 124. Furthermore, it is not so much about God having a supposed answer or reason or greater good for any suffering, but why God might remain silent about it. So it's not that there isn't a reason, it's God doesn't tell you the reason. Right, so there's a further issue here. It's one thing to say that God didn't stop the 2004 tsunami because of some reason X, but that God is not forthcoming about A, there being no reason at all, or being a reason at all, and B, what exactly that reason might be
Right.
in this case.
The silence, we're all guessing what this would be. Yeah.
So exactly. So instead, as they say, humans have to pick up the pieces and A, suppose that there is a reason at all, and B, work out exactly what that reason might be, given that God has decided to remain utterly silent on the matter.
So you have, like, I can already think of two Christian explanations. This was all good in one way, and you could imagine wild, weird ideas of somehow this was a good thing. The other is, well, they sinned, they were sinners, right? So it's always this explanation of like, oh, well, they were sodomites, or there were people who were devil worshippers in the land, or whatever. So there's some repercussion that come upon these people. But then, was everybody guilty? Were any of these people innocent? It's like that idea of Sodom and Gomorrah. There's 5 righteous, right? There's always these stories that you want to go off of.
I think the best example of that is the murder of the firstborn that God does, which is like, so Pharaoh's heart is hardened by God, right? Pharaoh says no to letting the slaves go. So what does God do? Well, he's already made Pharaoh say no, and then after making him say no, he punishes him for saying no. But he doesn't punish Pharaoh. He punishes the entire nation of Israel, of Egypt,
yeah,
by killing the firstborn children, right? So hang on, are you saying so Christians and Orthodox Jews have to say one of several things? They have to either say, well, some greater good came out of these children dying, which is to use these children instrumentally, which is consequentialist ethics, or that literally every single Egyptian child was evil and deserved it. Like, right. This includes like newborn babies. Like, yep. Are you telling me, and if all Egyptian children are just inherently evil and deserve being killed, then that's on God for designing and the universe in such a way that Egyptian children were born to be evil. So right. It's a problem. Anyway,
the same problem with the numbering of the soldiers with David. So you have in Samuel and Chronicles, the accounts where he goes to number the children of Israel. They're going to war. People have all sorts of different, and there are different explanations for why God is going to punish. But because he numbered, he didn't trust in God. He should have not trusted in the numbers of his army. But because David, the king, numbered Israel's soldiers for battle, God gave him 3 choices. All 3 are bad. You have to pick out of the 3, and none of them are good.
Classic trilemma.
Yes, other nations come, destroy you, and take you into slavery is one of them. Another one is the one that it ends up becoming is the Lord smites them. And of course, an angel of death caused like a freaking a COVID-19 to drop bombs on them. And like, I can't remember how many thousands of Israelites died because, well, David shouldn't have counted how many humans were in his army for battle. Bad man. Okay. So what the hell's going on here? Like, yeah. When you look at it and you're no longer a person trying to defend your little bubble that I used to be, this becomes apparently obvious that there's something wrong, especially if you're trying to believe that this God's good. He's got a good plan for you too. If he's doing that to his own nation, his own chosen people, according to its own literature, it just, can you trust it? Can you really know that he has all things together for good? But he might also send you a plague, or he might do this. If you don't do this, he's going to do that. Goodness gracious.
And yeah, 100%. And the final tongue-in-cheek conclusion I come to in this chapter is that A, OmniGod loves playing really long games of hide and seek, or B, OmniGod does not exist. So there you go.
So imagine a natural catastrophe. COVID-19. Well, there's dispute on COVID-19 whether or not it actually started in a lab or not. But let's just say Ebola, okay, and this was not a manufactured thing. This is something natural that or AIDS or whatever it might be. There's still people who think this stuff isn't natural. But let's just say a plague hits us, okay, and we're now saying it was God. Like after the fact, there's an explanation for why this happened. Well, it's our God. Let's take that numbering the children of Israel. Imagine a real plague hit Israel at this time, the children of Israel. And they're saying it's their God, because that's just how they describe things in the ancient world. Like they did this. It was God behind the scenes that actually did this. But they're writing these mythological tales, these stories about how that happened. Today, we still have this happen today where people are saying, oh, well, God sent that the floods down in New Orleans. when the hurricane came in and all this stuff went crazy, because America drifted off toward homosexuality. Like there's a sin, right? So they have to explain why it happened.
Yeah, it's a classic. I mean, again, we've talked about this before, which is like the only way of explaining badness in the world, any form of badness, is to blame humans. Because if you don't blame humans, it's effectively God's fault. And God can't be at fault for badness, right? Because it makes God bad. So the job of theologians and of apologists and Christians is to get God off the hook. So it's interesting you talk about like blaming labs. I wonder if there's a correlation between belief in God, like say being Christian, and believing that things like any pandemic was created in a lab. Because as soon as you make that move to say it was created in a lab, irrespective of whether it was or not, like the desire, to believe in a conspiracy that is created in a lab is to blame humans, right? And then that gets God off the hook, because this thing isn't being created naturally, and where God has somehow more moral culpability over that and sovereignty over that, rather than human affairs, even though God created and designed and created all humans and knew we would do this and created the world in which we would do this such that we would do this. So God doesn't get off the hook anyway. But
that's the thing I think is interesting about this whole belief in God. Is God necessary at all in all of this is the point. Because now we're trying to explain evil, and they keep trying to do so by having God or bad things that happen and suffering and such. And rather than looking to a natural world, some of this stuff, this is the confusion that gets kind of ugly, is like suffering seems to be part and parcel of the theology of Christianity. It's almost like in early Christianity, when you're reading the literature, martyrdom and suffering and persecution complex and stuff, like you're not a real true Christian if you're not really experiencing this. So it's almost like a self-fulfillment to put yourself in harm's way, to be ridiculed, to be persecuted, to be harmed, or to try and cause something like this to happen upon yourself. It seems like that's something that is built into the theology. I'm not saying that's the case all across the board. I think, for example, Nero was probably a horrible individual. But the point is that I don't think in all cases, a lot of the scholars, and I'm going to be talking to Cantina Moss, but a lot of the scholars say that like Christians were breaking the laws on purpose to go out here, and they were doing things that certain laws of the lands were prohibiting, like group meetings in public places where you can stir riots and stuff like that. Here the Christian is going, Jesus is on my side. I'll just go break the law and actually go and preach this stuff publicly. And then when he gets persecuted, guess what he turns into? A saint. He turns into a martyr, a saint. Anyway, I'm like picking specifically on Christianity because that's where I came out of. But super chats. Constellation Pegasus, when you interview your Jehovah's Witness friends, ask them if they are aware of the beardless Jesus from 1932 to 1968.
I will try and remember that. Drop by my channel and yeah, check that out and ask that question. Beardless Jesus. I always find it interesting. Like, this is not to answer your or even to talk to what you're saying, but the idea of, you see these pictures, you often see these memes of like, this is what Jesus would have looked like, and then it's like, this is what Jesus looks like in all Christian art, most Christian art that you see around, which is like your Aryan Jesus. It's like, yeah, well, someone from really the Fertile Crescent would not look like that, and it plays with the idea that really the idea of God is a social construction, is just a projection of you, isn't it? It's just a projection of us, and you make God in your own image. And anyway, I'm going off on one, but yeah.
No. Like, I make thumbnails for every video I do, and when I'm looking for Bible thumbnails, I'm always running across art that is never like, these are Semitic looking people in any way, shape, or form. It's always some European in the Middle Ages that's doing this. Let me show you just an example that I think is funny. Actually, let me get an image. I'm gonna pull it up. Like earlier, I actually added, just to show you the kind of work I put into it, I'll add saturation, and I will add like color to the images to give it a little like different than what it originally was. Let me delete this one, just add it. I worked very hard on this one. This one's coming up next week. This is going to be a really good interview, by the way. Here we go. So I added the redness to the skin because, dude, they were paper white. I mean, he almost matched his little tunic down here, you know?
Yeah.
But, oh, super chat's showing up. Let me do that. But yeah. So yeah. I'm looking forward to that. That'll be fun. But I'll add color to it just because it's like, just make it as realistic as I can. I'm being an artist anyway by making thumbnails. So, but yeah, whose super chat was that? I want to just say thank you again as we move on to the next.
Constellation Pegasus, or at least has got another one in.
Okay. C Truth says, Bible says the message or the gospel is nonsense to non-believers. If someone says the logic evidence convinced them, it isn't Christian. Keep up the good work. Thank you. Yeah, and C Truth, go subscribe to his YouTube channel, Steven Sorensen. He's doing all sorts of fun stuff, especially on forgeries, and his editing has really stepped up in terms of his quality. Thank you, man. Festering Boils, thank you for the super chat. If God is all good and loving, why'd he put poison fruit and a crafty tempter in our garden?
So we talked about this in the very first video. There are loads of issues with a real Adam and Eve. So if you actually believe in a factual historical Adam and Eve, there are so many problems. Not least that if God does have full divine foreknowledge, he would know that Adam and Eve would make the decisions that they did, and yet created that scenario anyway. So the fall is entirely predicted by God, and in fact designed into the system by God. So God had the knowledge of all counterfactuals before creating the universe, right? And so he says, right, if I create this universe, in this universe, Adam and Eve will be tempted at this point, and they will eat from the fruit. They eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and this will happen. It will be the fall, and it will create sin into the world, and this will happen, and that will happen, and oh my God, it's all original sin, and it's all their fault. He says that out of all the infinite number of universes that I could create, I am creating that one. So it's like none of us had a choice over that creation. Adam and Eve didn't have a choice over that creation. Adam and Eve didn't design themselves. God designed and created them, knowing exactly what they would do. So God is ultimately responsible for everything that happens in this universe, because God created this universe knowing exactly what would happen, and God could have easily not have created this universe.
Thank you so much, Festering Boils. Constellation Pegasus, thank you so much for all the super chats, my friend. Humans have landed on the moon, photographed black holes, and are on the eve of seeing the first galaxies and stars. So we can't agree on the book you're talking about. Yeah, I see a problem here.
So I think there's an interesting discussion around epistemology here. So epistemology being the study of knowledge. So when you look at epistemological frameworks that we have, so we use science. Science as a method, as a scientific method, is a way, and it's a self-correcting method, especially when it works well, of arriving at greater and greater knowledge of everything in the known universe, right? Think how much knowledge science as a practice has added to our knowledge base. How much knowledge over the last 2,000 years. And then say, what has religion, or what has Christianity added to our knowledge base in the last 2,000 years? Really, what has it done to help us gain knowledge about the universe around us? And you know, as an epistemological framework, religion or Christianity or Islam are not very useful. And those revelations in themselves are incredibly epistemologically problematic. So, yeah, anyway, there you go.
I'm with you. By the way, I do want to do a show with you at some point where we actually deal with pantheism and polytheism and various deism and different things, just because the omni stuff is pretty easy to just kind of, you know, disregard using certain logical argumentations, whatever we might be trying to argue. But I would be interested in like taking a live where we actually allow people who come in from various different areas to challenge and to say, why would you be atheist instead of pantheist or whatever? You know what I mean?
I think, well, polytheist, let's talk about just very briefly, not the panentheists and pantheists, but polytheists or any kind of other gods that are slightly less than. That's fair enough. Believe in that. But you are degrading God's capabilities. Like, just understand that God is now less than what God could be. So, if you think about multiple gods doing the job of one god, each of those gods are less than what. This is why Christians came up with, or theologians came up with, the ontological argument, which is to say it's the greatest thing in conception. You can imagine no greater thing than that, and of which one of those characteristics is existence. Therefore, it exists, type thing, and you kind of logic into existence God. But any other type of God is a degradation in some sense of what God could be. And I think that's interesting. It's like, fair enough, you can believe in that, but it's a bit of a two-part God, or a bit of a poor cousin.
I'm just saying they could bring their challenging questions to have you respond to them if they're coming from one of the other types of, like, we might be singing to the choir, to theists in the chat, to most theists that aren't even Christian or from an Abrahamic faith. So Constellation Pegasus, thank you again. You two need to repent and get involved with Jehovah's Witness Jehovah's organization. After all, Armageddon is right around the corner. 1874, 1914, 1918 to 20, 1925, 1975. It's. I think
it's a rapture. It's a rapture. It's a rapture. It's not. We got the time wrong.
Yeah, it's
a rapture. It's a rapture. It's a. We got it wrong again. Yeah. Right, hang on. Let's go back. Let's do right. We got the interpretation. It's a rapture. Yeah, so on and so forth. Ad infinitum. Yeah, quite.
Thank you so much again, man, for showering me with love this morning. I really appreciate that. Mr. Monster, thank you for the super chat. What if George Washington made America a monarchy and became king of America?
Then you'd be almost as awesome as Britain.
Thank you, Mr. Monster. If there are no gods, thank you for the super chat, Oflamio, then what do atheists talk about all day?
We talk about fiction. It's like this is a big fiction book club. Like, we could talk about Harry Potter all day. You can go to a Harry Potter channel and talk about Harry Potter. We love talking about the Bible and God and Jesus. This, like, I'd say, this mythical character, this legendary character that yeah. So, that's what we talk about.
I think it's, for me, there's multiple reasons why I spend all my time studying this stuff. Religion has a major impact. It's fun to talk about fictions and dealing with mythology, but because you see, I think I'm reading right now Daniel Dennett's book.
By the way, just to let you know that what I mainly think about all day and talk about with my partner is how long I'm going to roast the baby I'm going to eat.
Right, that's what atheists really talk about. You're not supposed to say that in public, though. But yeah,
breaking the spell.
Breaking the spell. Yeah. It's really good. I started it, and it's like he even, like, in the opening when he's like referring to the people who are reading this book, Daniel Dennett. If you haven't read this, it's worth reading. I started it, and he pretty much just kind of gives you a forewarning, like, hey, it's going to sound like I'm saying things you don't think need to be said, but I'm actually dealing with an American audience. And he said, you don't understand what's going on in America. All of you people out here in the world, in the European countries that don't have this extreme fundamentalism of Christianity in your country, which is influencing the politics and everything that goes on. You really need to understand America, and you'll understand then why I say some of the things I do in this book and why this is something worth discussing. Look,
I'm fairly obsessed. So most of my audience in my writing is American. And so I am obsessed, not because of that. I'm also obsessed with American politics just intrinsically. Right. But American politics and religion just obsess me because they're so vastly different from the UK. Well, we're moving that way in terms of politics, but how religion intersects with society, that it's just compulsive viewing, just like a car crash is, you have to turn and watch it.
I had to turn the little brightness up for a second just to read this. Is religion good for you? Should it be the basis for morality? And then he goes on, for many people around the world, perhaps most people, there is nothing more important than religion. And when something is that prevalent, right? And it has that kind of impact in the world, but he points out especially a strange, radical version of it in America, it's worth talking about. And yeah. So, but as far as it comes to my wife, we don't talk about this stuff ever. Like
No.
she doesn't care to talk about what we do here on MythVision. I mean, other than how can I help you, like those type of things. She knows I have a lot on my plate, but she's not like, hey, I can't wait to talk. Tell me more about what you figured out about Jesus today. Like, no, she's like, okay, so Caden has an appointment for his teeth. We got an eye appointment here. We got to go to their football game. Can we go watch a movie on family night? What movie do you want to watch? What do you want for dinner? Rub my back. My back hurts. Will you crack my back? Like we're just humans, right? But yeah, we don't sit and talk about this all day. In fact, it's kind of a hobby, but it's my full-time job, and I get to love to do what I'm doing. I like the question. That's why I spent so much time on it. So Constellation Pegasus, thank you. Did Jesus return in 1844 or 1914? Can you two help? Well, according to Preterist, it was 70 AD. So depends on who you ask, Thank you, Constellation.
To be honest, I'm here now. So it's actually 2022. So
the initiates were supposed to only know that. But I guess they, probably went over most people's heads anyway. Oh, Flamio,
if you guys were on my Patreon, you would know it's me. I don't have a Patreon, so.
Oh, you need to set one up. Oh, Flamio, does fiction have ontological existence?
So, interesting question, perhaps. Fictions exist independently in human minds, right? And things are interpreted. So I will interpret Harry Potter very differently to Derek or whatever. This is why this is interesting is because this is just the same as how any abstract ideas work. I've talked to you briefly about this before because this is hugely important as to how, I set this out in my recent book, which I keep banging on about, why I am atheist and not atheist, how to do knowledge, meaning and morality in a godless world. So what the bottom of my brickwork of my entire worldview is made of is the ontology, like existence. What's everything made of? Material existence, but abstract ideas. So what are abstract ideas? And morality is an abstract idea. And I would argue that there is no such thing as an objective morality because you can't have abstract ideas that exist outside of the human mind. And even if you do, you are subjectively interpreting them. So even if you say that morality exists in God, there's still an epistemological barrier between me and God. That means that I have to interpret that subjectively anyway. I don't know if I've got the right moral diktat. I don't know if I've got the right God. I don't know if I've interpreted that moral proclamation in the right way, and so on and so forth. And what the baggage am I bringing to that interpretation? So the idea is that all ideas, any idea, any thought, any concept, it is dependent upon the conceiver. I'm what's called a conceptual nominalist. So abstract ideas don't exist out there. There's no realm in which abstract ideas exist. Abstract ideas exist in here. And when we agree on them, we write dictionaries and we write encyclopedias and then we write laws. And if we agree on them philosophically and we write laws, then we vote for the right people in who can enact those laws. Like human rights don't exist. We construct them. And hopefully we enforce them on humanity by having embedded laws that are voted in and enacted by people and then enforced by people who enforce that legislation. So this seems like a very sort of throwaway question. Does fiction have ontological existence, right? All abstract ideas have ontological existence, but they exist in our minds independently. And our job is to, in the marketplace of ideas, is to show how our ideas are better than your ideas or whatever. This idea is better than that idea, and why the world should adopt these ideas rather than those ideas, and why we should vote for these people because they are going to enact those ideas, and why we should vote for these people because they are going to enforce these ideas, so on and so forth.
Thank you for that question, Oflamio. Catholic convert, thank you for the super chat. Make the sign of the cross so I know you not demon. I don't know what version would convince you that I'm not a demon. This or this, like doing the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. I don't know what version you would want, my friend.
This? No.
You're freezing.
Am I?
Yeah, it'll like sometimes it'll come in and out. So anyway.
Oh well.
Thank you for the super chat, Catholic convert. All right.
So, but now this is where we've ended section 4, part 4, and now it's the afterlife and heaven and hell. And it turns out we've already been talking for 1 hour 50 minutes. So, really, this is the best time to end because actually the next section is a huge section that it would take a good whole other video. Actually, it's probably like the afterlife, the soul, and then heaven and hell. That's such a big topic, and you know how much we love talking. So I think now is a good time to wrap it up, because otherwise we'll stop in the middle of that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's perfectly fine. Well, then what we need to do is let everybody know our conversations, which have been kind of open conversations and allowing audience questions and things like that. If you have a question, super chat it now, because we're wrapping things up, and I'd be more than happy to ask Jonathan anything that you guys want to ask. Feel free to get the book. This is what the entire episode that we're doing is about. We're going into this book, and just to show you 1 through 30, taking our time, having a fun conversation. We're not covering exhaustively everything that can be said. His book covers way more in detail, so you obviously want to get the book on Amazon.
It's a nice short book, and actually really readable book as well. So please do, and please, if you like it, please put a review. It makes a big difference.
Yeah, he could definitely use the reviews; those always help. And so Kindle $9.49, get it in paperback $16.99. Yeah, that's the book.
And we're up to argument 19. So what I love about books like this is that I presented 30 arguments, actually 31 because there's a bonus chapter. But actually each chapter has like 20 versions or arguments that are to do with that argument in it. So as you can see from today, we've covered something like, I don't know, 7 arguments maybe, but we've talked extensively on it.
Yeah, you go deep in this, man. Dan Barker did the forward. Of course, Dan Barker's debated. I think he's like the #1 atheist who's done more debates with anyone in the world. You also have the YouTube channel.
I'm interviewing Dan Barker on Sunday.
Are you?
Yeah.
He's a fun guy to talk to. I always enjoy talking with him. Make sure you subscribe to his channel. Let me put that in the chat again so everybody can go subscribe to A Tippling Philosopher. That is Jonathan MS Pearce's YouTube channel. Please go subscribe.
And of course, the true irony is that my middle names are MS, and I put the MS there because there's a football commentator called Jonathan Pearce. And I've had this before. I remember years ago, I was arguing against a reformed epistemologist, a Calvinist, and he wrote a blog piece absolutely attacking me. He went to town on me, like attacking my ideas. It absolutely failed. But he put a picture of Jonathan Pearce, a football commentator. He'd just gone to Wikipedia, got that. And it's like, yeah. And I was like, yeah, fair enough. But that's not me, by the way. So I put MS in there. But I've also got MS. I've got multiple sclerosis. And when I gave my first public talk after I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis back in 2018-19, I gave a talk to a skeptics in a pub talk. And they were like, we were trying to work out what the MS stood for. And then you said you got MS. And I can't believe you put your MS. I was like, no, it doesn't mean I do have MS, but it's just fluke. Anyway.
What are the coincidences? Yeah, it was divine.
Thanks, God.
Definitely. And our friend Catholic Convert said Jonathan didn't do it. He could be possessed.
I think I could be, though. I think you're right, actually. I'm going to go. I'll let you know. I'm going to see. I'm going to give it a test. I think I am possessed, but it might be a stomach bug. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think you need to get the priest over to check it out. Let's make sure. You know what I mean? And thank you so much for these conversations, Jonathan. Like, I always enjoy talking with you, and thank you for reminding me I am in this busy time. For those who don't know, I'm packing up. All my books are here. Bookshelves are empty. We are moving. We are moving across the country to Washington State, which is why I have, this morning at the beginning of this video, wanted to plug my Patreon, because every month, for whatever reason, whether their payment method isn't set up right or whatever, I get a lot of Patreons that drop. And this is what I do full time. So if you want to help support me, you want to private message me, you have ideas for scholars you'd like to have interviewed, I do listen to my Patreon members, and I investigate scholars they recommend to do potential interviews with. In fact, let me give you an example. Well, this right here, Paul Ellis doing the city of Islam, Jerusalem. He was one recommended to me. Another one that was recommended. Well, one of my patrons said I needed to get back Ben Stanhope. This one right here, I would have never known about if it weren't for one of my Patreon members. So you can remain confidential. I have Christians who actually support me. I have variations. Doesn't matter what you believe, but a lot of the Christians are like, don't tell anybody that, like I'm paying you, to help support you. But I love what you're doing and bringing education. We could disagree at the end of the day, but I do appreciate what you do with MythVision. So consider helping out that way.
Do it.
Yeah, you can also do the thanks button. I finally figured that out on YouTube. There's, who told me we were in competitive race with Jonathan. He was like, hey, have you got any thanks? I imagine you've got a lot of those thanks. And I looked and you've had more than I have.
Yeah, and I've only had like a couple. Like I'm just a minnow compared to you. So, no, I really enjoy these conversations, and thank you for the opportunity to express myself and talk about my books. But I hope your viewers get something out of this. I believe I hope it's stimulating, and if you're a theist, these. So what's really important about stuff like this is that we've done the resurrection, and we're going to do the nativity to some extent. So you can do the biblical exegesis and evaluate the history and the theology of these things, and say all the bells and whistles of Christianity and argue about that. But until you get over these abstract arguments, this is irrelevant. This can't happen if you can't sort out the answers to this. So this in philosophy we'd say this supervenes on this. It depends upon this. So you've got to do the work on this stuff, because if you can't square the circles here, then your God doesn't make sense. It doesn't matter whether atonement makes sense, because your God doesn't exist and can't exist.
A few more super chats as we're wrapping up. I really appreciate the support. Constellation Pegasus. Jimmy Swaggart really went underground. Really went underground all of these years. Kind of sad, actually.
Constellation Pegasus is the gift that keeps on giving, quite literally.
Literally. Thank you, my friend. I will keep my eye out on Armageddon. You have warned me, so I'm definitely doing that. Kind of worried now, Thank you. Shireen, fundy churches up here in Scotland claiming to be non-denominational who are fans of Kenneth Copeland, doesn't shock me, bans blast Hillsong and push a political agenda. That's welcome to the South, more than the South. I mean, like, welcome to the United States, honestly.
I'd be interested if that's a growing thing, if that's a modern, because there's this idea that churches are dying, that belief is dying off in the UK. You look at the British Attitude Survey, you look at the census reports and everything like that. Belief is getting less and less in the UK in God, but there is some argument to say that fundamental churches and church attendance is dropping massively, but fundamentalist evangelical churches arguably aren't dropping, or if they are, maybe not so much. So I'd be interested to know whether there is data to suggest that so there is growth in that kind of church at the expense of other more kind of old school traditional churches.
I don't know. I just know that these non-denominational or denominational, Pentecostal, whatever, these spirit-filled, as they like to call, type of churches are so experientially based. They're so, you can go there and walk out and feel like you'll feel different. So there's kind of a high. It's like going to the bar, you're going to go get your buzz, but you can get this buzz of excitement and whatnot from this concert that they're blasting about Jesus, if that makes sense. So
yeah.
Thank you, Shireen. Melody Joy, thank you for the super sticker. I really appreciate the support, seeing you in the chat, and for being a member of MythVision on the actual YouTube. Thank you. Mott, has anyone had the humanist decency to pray for Satan, the one person who needs it the most? That's actually really...
So one of the big arguments I was going to come to in the next section is about Satan and about how anything that Satan does is on the behest of God. And you will have heard me say this in multiple videos before, but Satan is God's middle management executive, right? So like the idea, or middle manager, the idea that anything that Satan does is allowed to happen by God, because God is omnipotent. So therefore, if you're praying to Satan, you're really praying to God, because Satan is just like, the idea that Satan is like evil and gets away with doing this stuff.
Right.
God could extinguish Satan like that. So therefore, any existence that Satan has, literally existence, let alone what Satan does, is on the behest of God and is allowed by God, and it therefore is what God wants. So if Satan does anything, it is exactly what God wants Satan to do.
Right.
And therefore, if you're praying to Satan, you're really praying to God.
Interesting. Thank you, Mop, for the super chat. And then Ricky Johnson with the super sticker and for being a member. I really appreciate the support, my friend. Everybody in the chat, I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Make sure you go and also check out his blog. Want to tell us about it real quick?
Well, yeah, it's not so much a blog; it's a column. Technically I'm a journalist now, or certainly a columnist. So I write about things like politics, as you can see, guns in there, but also about theology and there about ensoulment. I was going to talk about that Midnight Mass one, because Midnight Mass, I wrote a huge review on the Netflix show Midnight Mass, and it's going to come into when we talk about the afterlife. There's some really interesting ideas in the script for Midnight Mass, which is just basically it's a horror series, but it's not. It's really a vehicle for delivering Mike Flanagan's atheology, really, and criticisms of the Catholic Church and theism in general. So I really liked it. There are big ponderous scenes of dialogue, but they're heavy with philosophy and ideas. So, and we're going to be talking about
entertaining to watch.
Yeah, I really liked it.
Okay.
I really liked it. So yeah. That's my column at Only Sky, a media platform for the non-religious. Check it out, please.
Awesome. Okay, everybody go check them out. Thank you. I hope everybody enjoys the rest of the day. Let's see what we got coming up, just so that everybody who's watching has a cue on MythVision what I have planned. Let me show you. So I have tomorrow, if there is not a hurricane in Florida, Dr. Robin Faith Walsh will be on tomorrow to talk about the Apostle Paul. On Monday, Dr. Francesca Stavrakopoulou, because I don't work weekends now. On Tuesday, I might have an open theist, maybe a couple different interviews that day. Come on. On Wednesday, I'm having Why Abraham Murdered Isaac, and I want to properly figure out how to pronounce the name of the scholar who has 2 PhDs. Dr. Candida Moss is next Thursday, and then Dr. James Tabor, I'm actually going, it won't be live, I'm going in person to his house to do in-person interviews, and those will get edited and put up on the Patreon early. We have like 6 to 8 questions that I want to do in high quality recording with him at his office or his house, one or the other, that will be early access to those who are Patreon fans of MythVision, which keeps me going. So I've got some really good content coming, and thank you. Any final words from you, Jonathan, to our audience?
No, well, thank you, audience. People like Ricky Johnson there. That's fantastic. Always a good support. Melody, all these names that I know as well. So fantastic. Really hope you enjoyed this, and stay tuned, because we'll do one other, I would have thought, on this book, and that will probably finish it off. But please, if you've got disposable income enough to afford it, please go out and grab the book, because it allows me to kind of do what I do, which is
exactly.
This.
Thank you, man. I always appreciate you. And ladies and gentlemen, never forget, we are MythVision. And now for the naked Jesus.
Woo!